So I'm in Kyoto, Japan, and welcome to my next edition of Kemogi's Street Brain Radio. And I'm going to talk about metacognition, the ability to see oneself as if you were outside of you. And this, I think, is very important in our daily lives and social skills, and also in ultimate and fundamental questions like the origin of consciousness. So I'll start with the mundane daily life aspects of metacognition. Now, metacognition is, for example, when you know you don't know something. In brain science, there's a function called feeling of knowing, which would tell you that you know something even if you can't remember that immediately. For example, if you were asked what was the capital of the United States, of course the answer is Washington, D.C. But even if you can't come up with the idea, with the answer, immediately you would feel that you know the answer, right? So that's feeling of knowing, and it is known that the feeling of knowing is constructed in the prefrontal cortex. But on the other hand, if you were asked why the right-hand term of Einstein's equation in general relativity, unless you know it, you actually don't, you can't, you immediately know that you don't know the answer, right? So in that case, you don't have a feeling of knowing. So this feeling of knowing is very important in your life, and it's also a great way to train your brain, because for example, if you can't remember the name of a friend and yet you have the feeling of knowing, then it would be a great idea to try to remember the name, because that would involve your brain's circuit, including the prefrontal cortex and temporal cortex, where in the association area, the name of your friend would be stored. So the circuit that is involved in retrieving the information from the temporal cortex onto the working memory-related circuits in the prefrontal cortex would be activated and trained, and it will be strengthened if you try to remember that. So it might take some time, but the effort is worth it. So next time you can't, remember the name of your friend, don't give it up. And nowadays it's very easy to give it up because you have all these external devices, and you might actually Google. And there's a famous paper about the Google effect, which tells you that once you know that you can Google it up later, you are less likely to remember it. So, this dependence on external digital devices has made circuits in the brain weaker. So, the feeling of knowing is a great chance to reinstate that functionality of retrieving that information from the temporal cortex to the prefrontal area. Having said that, it's quite interesting that some people seem to lack this metacognitive function. And, for example, I think the hallmark of intelligence is the ability to know when you don't know. So, very thoughtful people would hesitate when answering questions that they don't know for sure. But people who are not so conscientious about their knowledge would try to answer it immediately. So that is a clear case of lack of metacognition, and that can be problematic. And when a person is known to answer irresponsibly, when he or she doesn't know the answer, that person can be, less trustworthy than others. And some people are like that. Some people confabulate even when they don't know the answer. So, the hallmark of high intelligence is actually the ability to say, I don't know. Of course, if you say that to me frequently, then it would also mean that you know nothing. But, saying I don't know is much better than saying I know everything. And especially when it comes to questions about the fundamental properties of life, for example, intelligence, consciousness, and so on. Sometimes it's better, much better, to say I don't know than to say I know the answer. You encounter people who come up to you and say they know the answer to the fundamental questions of life, and they know how consciousness arises, and what is the nature of God, and what is the absolute truth, and so on. When you encounter these people, of course you become suspicious, because you calculate in your mind that the probability that they actually know the answer is much less than the probability that they are just confabulating or lacking metacognition that they don't know. So, I think the safe bet would be to assume that they actually don't know, but actually lacking the metacognition of the absence of that knowledge. So anyway, I'm talking not only about the laymen but also professionals. I have been studying the science of consciousness for a couple of decades now, and I encounter often people who say that they can explain consciousness in terms of something, but from my point of view, they actually don't know the answer. So I think what they are lacking is metacognition of the fact that they don't know the answer. And this can actually go to a very high level of academics. I mean, so when you have someone who has published many papers and is well respected in some circles of the academia, and these people would actually come across to you as somebody who is totally lacking in metacognition. That happens so often. I hope I am not lacking my fundamental metacognition here, but that is my observation. Anyway, so back to our daily lives. So it is very important to know that you don't know something. And here I need to touch on the so-called Dunning-Kruger effect. Maybe you know this effect. It was reported by Dunning and Kruger, and it tells you that people who are not actually knowledgeable about or skillful of a certain cognitive domain tends to be confident about their ability. And those people who are actually proficient in something know that they actually are not capable of doing something, and so they are more modest and humble. So this is something that needs to be done. It needs to be recognized when dealing with students in classrooms, and also facing and evaluating your own learning environment. For example, I have a really great friend who is a shogi master, Yoshihara Habu, who used to be the 7 crown champion, meaning he won 7 major titles, and he actually had a monopoly of the titles that are there in the great board game of shogi at the time. So he's a well-respected person in Japan, but at the same time he's so he's a man of such a humility. He says that he doesn't know the board game of shogi, and he thinks sometimes he feels that sometimes from time to time he feels as if the god of game of shogi is quite nearby, but he can't really grasp it. And when he said that, it's really wonderful. But although he has been grand champions many times over, actually he has won 99 titles so far. So one more to go until he makes the century. But he's such a modest and subdued person. And on the other hand, if you ask a random guy from on the street and ask about some subject, some of them actually answer that they know quite well about a certain subject, and that is the Dunning-Kruger effect on work. So when it comes to playing musical instruments or speaking English like I'm doing, the more you become proficient, the more humble you become, actually, because you realize how much space of improvement there are still. And actually, the fact that there's a car advertising politicians just passed by. It's a really weird aspect of Japanese politics. I mean, it's just mere exposure effect in work. The politicians believe that if you bombard people with faces, pictures, and voices of them, then they would get more vote rather than saying what kind of policies they would advocate. And this is a ridiculous aspect of Japanese politics. But anyway, so I'm walking in one of the back streets of Kyoto towards Kyoto Station, and I'm talking about metacognition this time. So as I was saying, some people are totally lacking in metacognition, and the Dunning-Kruger effect describes that. So it's always great if you are humble about a skill in any cognitive domain. If you're writing a book, it'll be great. If you don't satisfy yourself with what you have written, if you are a business person, it'll be great if you don't boast on your past achievements. I mean, it's always, no matter how successful you are, even if you are Elon Musk, there would be things that you haven't done and you could have done. So, that is a great measure of the potentiality for growth and learning, because people who are not satisfied would have a great opportunity to grow, and people who are satisfied with the status quo, they do not have a lot of space for growth. Anyway, so that's metacognition, and that's Dunning-Kruger effect. By the way, there are some reports of research that question some subtle details of the Dunning-Kruger effect. But as with many things with cognitive science, well, it's not something like physics, where you have a really strict law about how elementary particles behave. Cognitive science is, of course, bolstered with a lot of data, but it's actually also art of storytelling. So if cognitive science research tells you a robust, helpful story about how humans are, then you probably would take a hint from it. And of course, you are a professional researcher. It'll be great to test the details of Dunning-Kruger effect, for example, or the same can be said about the so-called marshmallow test. This is the idea that when you are a small kid, if you can wait for a few minutes before you eat your favorite sweet, like the marshmallow, then you would be more likely to do well later in your life in terms of school performances and social achievements. And this theory this experiment is very, very famous. And, it's an interesting idea because waiting until you told to go with eating your favorite sweet would involve prefrontal area, and the ability to inhibit your urge until an appropriate juncture of time would actually be a really wonderful cognitive skill to be employed in your daily life. So it makes sense that the marshmallow test would translate to your great performance in your later life. But again, there are some reports that question the reproducibility of this particular research. And, it is actually interesting to work out the details and verify the, supposed implications of such a research. But at the same time, the marshmallow test is a great story. And, cognitive science research is always like that. It's always at that level. I'm not advocating here, hand-waving approach, hand-waving mindset in cognitive science. I'm just saying that some results of research can be useful, even if they cannot be verified on the same level of rigor as the physical laws, because it's not within the nature of cognitive science to be verified with the same level of rigor as the laws in physics. And I don't think I'm saying something weird here. I mean, I think it's something that you need to take into account. So all my talk about metacognition today is not on the level of rigor like the elementary particle physics, but it's on the level of, scientifically robust and well-told stories. I was born in October, but if you say that people who were born in October would have such and such personality traits, that would be really terrible. There's no rationale for that. That's astrology for you. So I don't give a damn about astrology. But cognitive science research is, not something like astrology, but it's something that can be appreciated and that can be discussed and that can be employed in your life. Anyway, back to metacognition. So metacognition is something that is variable from an individual to individual, but I think it is something that can depend on the collective behavior of people. So, different cultures have different levels of metacognition. And for example, I live in Japan, and right now I'm in Kyoto, but I'm waiting for the traffic signal to change. Probably you can tell that from this sound, the noise that the signal for the passengers, not passengers, pedestrians are making. But I'm normally in Tokyo, and I've been making some complaints about the typical Japanese comedy. I don't appreciate them very much, although I do appreciate the classical comedy format of rakugo. I don't really care for the typical Japanese comedies as you would see on terrestrial television. The reason being that they seem to lack a level of metacognition about social issues. Well, the name of the game for comedians is to make noise about social issues. Well, it's not their, entire occupation, but it is a very important part of their job description, I think. So, for example, when there are stupid politicians, when there are social biases and prejudices and inequality, injustice, then it'll be a great job of the comedians to make laughter out of that, because you can become more flexible in your thinking. A great comedy is much better than straight criticism of these things, because straight criticisms can be sometimes problematic in their own way, because those who are criticized would be angry, and it can generate social tensions, and it can generate new echo chambers, and it's not really great. Identity politics is sometimes a great venue, a great vehicle to change society in general, but at the same time it can be quite problematic. And so comedians are sometimes vehicles of beneficial social changes, and I think comedians were many great comedians. Sacha Baron Cohen, for example, from the UK, is doing really great service to the community by raising issues of social injustice, and Ricky Gervais and Stephen Fry and all these great comedians. But in Japanese comedy, unfortunately, which are typically seen on Japanese TV, do not have that function. They tend to be more, slapstick, childlike depictions of laughter, which is okay in their own way. I used to appreciate them when I was a kid, but when I watched Monty Python's Flying Circus when I was 12, I learned that the world was much broader than what the Japanese comedians would tell us to believe. Anyway, because of the lack of critical comedy, I think Japanese society is missing a huge opportunity to have metacognition about many issues, social issues in this country, and that is a shame. And so Japan as a whole, at least in the comedy genre, I think is lacking metacognition of this opportunity to provide critical laughter for social issues. So on the other hand, about the English-speaking countries, I sometimes feel, I can't generalize too much here, but I sometimes feel that people lack the metacognition of how some people can be marginalized in the global culture. New York Times, for example, I am a really great admirer of New York Times, but however, when they write articles, they write actually great articles, and I love them. But sometimes the New York Times seems to be lacking metacognition of the position of those people who are marginalized, both culturally, politically, and economically in the world. Because let's face it, the New York Times, or the cluster of people, culture that they represent, is at the top of the pinnacle of the world cultural order. Of course, if you ask some editors from the New York Times if they think they're at the pinnacle of the world cultural order, they wouldn't say yes. But secretly, they might say yes. And anyway, so I'm in a really unique position where I was born in Japan, and I didn't learn English seriously until I was 12, as many kids back then were like. When you went to junior high school, you started to learn English, and I gradually learned to broaden my vision, and I'm grateful for that. But if I imagine the position of somebody who was forever encapsulated in the Japanese linguistic domain, living in this country, working here, and reading only Japanese texts and so on, I could imagine how they would feel when they read an article in the New York Times. And the same can be said probably for many regions in the world. Not only Japan, but also, other cultures which have different perspectives about the world from the New York Times. So, sometimes I feel, of course, ostensibly on the surface, people say that cultural diversity is important, and we should also all care for different people, different cultures, and so on. I sometimes feel that metacognition is not embodied as such, and this is a problem I feel I detect whenever I talk with someone who comes from dominant culture. The same can be said about domestic issues, like in this country. If you go to a local place in Japan and you talk with local people, sometimes you feel that people living in Tokyo has a vantage point of cultural transmission and publication and so on, without knowing it. I mean, so some people once told me that being born in Tokyo, having grown up in Tokyo, is a great talent in itself, which is a ridiculous way of putting it. But if you were born in Tokyo, you are more likely to, be able to go to university of great reputation. And if you're born in the local city, far from metropolitan centers like Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and so on, then of course it's possible to go to a great college, but at the same time it might be difficult, both financially, socially, economically, psychologically, to go to a great center of learning. So that kind of implicit barrier, so to speak, is something that should be acknowledged and something that should be worked on. But people don't realize it in many cases. And I think the same pattern is happening everywhere in the world. If you compare people in London with people with local communities in the UK, maybe there will be differences. If you compare people in New York with people in the southern states in the United States, for example, there would be similar problems. So I suspect that when there are discrepancies about your opinions about President Trump, for example, rather than these differences of opinions coming from a conscious choice of information or world views, I suspect that in many cases these differences would come from the embodied cognition. The differences, specifically the differences in embodied metacognition. And I think, this could work in both ways. I mean, I think people in marginalized cultures should probably have a metacognition of the fact that they might be limited in their capacity to see the world straightforwardly because of that. And people who are living in a privileged status, like those people who are living in New York, reading the New York Times, should probably have a metacognition about the positions of people who have been born and raised in different parts of the world. And I believe this is a very important issue in today's world. Anyway, so I think individual peoples can have difference in metacognition, and there could be also differences in metacognition across cultures and regions. And now I'm coming to a really interesting topic, which is that this idea that maybe the space program is related to possibilities for further evolution as a human species. I heard that Russia, the former Soviet Union, was one of the countries with advanced space program, and the reason why in the early periods the Russians were enthusiastic about the space program is partly due to the fact that there was some Russian theorists who put forward the idea that by going to space, the human species would step into the next stage of evolution, the ladder of evolution, if you like. And this is a fascinating idea. I've been talking about embodied metacognition, and it is different from just imagined or conceptual metacognition, because as a notion, of course, you can imagine how you would feel when you are in outer space, out of the Earth's orbit. But it's quite a different thing to actually go there and see the Earth from outside. Takashi Tachibana, a very well-known Japanese critic, wrote a wonderful book about how the space astronauts felt on returning to Earth. And it is fascinating to read that many of them actually have seen God. Yeah, literally. I mean, if you go to outer space, of course, you would be inspired and you would feel that you have come to elevated state of mind. But not only that, specifically, they have seen God. So sometimes astronauts on returning to the Earth would become really religious, or even start a new sect. And it's quite fascinating that these things happen to them with high probability. And Tachibana's book describes how the further you go from the Earth, the more likely and profound your encounter with God would become. And so if you were just circling around the Earth, you could have some mystic experiences. But if you, that is one level. But if you go to the moon, surface of the moon, and look back and see the blue planet, the Earthrise, from the horizons of the moon, then you are more likely to have mystic experiences and have an encounter with God, and you would be profoundly changed. And this is quite interesting. And so, of course, as we speak now, we can imagine how it would feel to go out into space and see Earthrise on the moon's horizon. You can imagine that. And with modern technology, maybe you can emulate that using I'm seeing a really huge cat. This is weird. I saw a really huge cat sculpture. That was weird. Jubei's in Kyoto? I don't know. I need to Google them up later. It's really interesting cat sculpture. By the way, when I talk into my iPhone like this, many people are actually passing by. But unlike a video recording, I don't have to feel so, embarrassed, because I feel I appear to be talking to somebody on the phone. So this is a great way to misguide people when you are recording Street Brain Radio. That's why I chose this format in recent days when I make recording. Anyway, where was I? So, imagining how you would feel, what you would see when you go out into space is different from, actually experiencing it. And with the advent of metaverse technologies and augmented realities and virtual realities and so on, people might say that you'll be able to emulate that effect artificially without actually going out to space. Well, that can be possible, but at the same time, I would argue that probably there will be an important difference in your experience between staying on the Earth and experiencing how it would feel to see the Earth from out there, to actually going out there and seeing the Earth from outside. So it'll be totally different. Anyway, so the Russian theologists, they had this theory that as we go out into space, the consciousness of humanity would evolve into the next level. And that was actually the motivation of the Russian, partly the motivation of the Russian space program in the early days. And that is a fascinating idea. I mean, rather than aiming for practical effects, like the development of new materials or, import of rare earth to Earth, they said that they thought that the greatest benefit that would get from getting out to space would be to able to evolve to the next stage of consciousness, which I think is probably sublime if that happens. So it'll be interesting, with SpaceX and Mr. Elon Musk planning a trip to Mars. We are entering, hopefully, into the next stage of space exploration. And with that, probably we would be able to have the next stage of embodiment of metacognition, in which we literally see ourselves, our blue planet, from the vantage point of outer space. Some people say that the most important image that we get in the 20th century was the image of the Voyager spacecraft as it traveled through the solar system and looked back in the direction of the Earth, and it spotted, for the last time, presumably, a tiny blue spot in the emptiness of the black space, and that was actually the Earth. So, the color of the Earth, the color of the dot, was totally different from the colors of other spots in the huge extension of space, and that was the planet Earth, our planet, and it showed how fragile our planet is. So, we are talking about global climate change, and people like Greta Thunberg is arguing for a better control of the Earth's planet, and Greta is saying that to go on the flight on the jet plane is a shame, which is probably true, but it'll be great to see what happens to Greta's psyche if she goes on a trip to the outer space, and it will probably consume a lot of energy, and the carbon footprint would be huge, but it might be actually worth it to put somebody like Greta Thunberg into the outer space and let her see the Earth, the blue planet, from the moon's surface. She might experience a fundamental change in her consciousness, and that might put her to the next level of metacognition, and that might be worth all the carbon footprints that is required. We'll see what happens to this idea. So I've been talking about metacognition on the individualistic level and cultural differences and the human species as a whole. But now I would like to move to the most fundamental question of all, consciousness. I believe that in order for us to be conscious, we would, require a fundamental level of metacognition. And the reason being that, as I said in my earlier postings, I believe in Mach's principle of perception, which I described in my book, Qualia and the Brain, which I am translating into English, and which I wrote in a book chapter published in Austria. And you can get a PDF of that on my webpage, or you can search for them. And anyway, so Mach's principle in perception conjectures that every aspect of consciousness comes from the mutual relationship between physical processes in the brain. And so if you have a bunch of neurons firing together, it would be through the mutual relationship between these neurons that consciousness arises, and which is of course a long shot. I mean, it's a moonshot. It's quite difficult to come up with a specific theory at present, but it's much better than the statistical theories that are rampant today. To be honest, I think the people who believe that consciousness can be explained by statistical approaches is fundamentally lacking metacognition. That's my metacognition. And so we do need to start from Mach's principle in perception. That's my belief. However, on top of that, in order to establish the relationship between physical processes like the neural firings in the brain, you need to have a metacognitive process, because otherwise you can't establish the relationship between neurons. So metacognition is actually very fundamental to qualia, consciousness, and so on. For example, if you have the qualia of red, then it will be based on the relationships between neural firings, including the neurons in area V4, where conscious perception of color is supposed to occur. And but in order for the relationship between neurons to be established, you do need metacognition. So you do need to have interaction between the prefrontal cortex, which is presumably the locus where metacognition happens, and the rest of the neural circuits. So from this perspective, it is quite interesting to observe the phenomenon of binocular rivalry. If you are familiar with the fact, this terminology, I would just remind you that binocular rivalry is when you have different inputs from the right eye and the left eye. Then in the visual field, it will be merged, and when the images are incompatible, either the left or right image would win over the other one. And this is binocular rivalry. And it's quite interesting because, in the early visual areas, like the primary visual cortex, activities corresponding to both of the incoming stimuli, left and right stimuli, are present. But, somewhere between the early visual cortex and the prefrontal cortex, a matching occurs, matching from the top between the bottom-up sensory processes and the top-down intentional processes would occur, so that only a subset, either left or right, for a given position of the visual field, would emerge in consciousness. So if you study this matching process between bottom and top-down processes, that would be at the core of the metacognitive processes that is at the fundamental level of our conscious experience. So I believe that consciousness equals metacognition. Consciousness equals metacognition. Consciousness is metacognition, and metacognition is consciousness. This, of course, needs to be worked out in more detail in future research. But it raises an interesting question whether artificial intelligence systems are capable of metacognition because they do not have any physical processes that corresponds to metacognition. Because for one thing, the exact details of the metacognitive processes in the naturally occurring neural circuits in the brain is not identified yet, and people haven't understood the gist of it. So that without understanding these things, you can't implement metacognitive processes in the artificial network. So it's probably fair to say that at present, artificial intelligence systems do not have metacognition. And this is a really fundamentally interesting viewpoint, I think. And if you believe that the conjecture that metacognition equals consciousness equals metacognition, then it logically follows that artificial intelligence systems cannot be conscious because they lack metacognition. And it might actually tell you why artificial intelligence systems are notoriously devoid of the ability to have a judgment about whether they know a thing or not. Large language models, they are really great, but sometimes they make really stupid mistakes, and even when they don't know something, they can't say, I don't know that. I mean, they would just go on to confabulate false statement about the world, and that has been pointed out to be one of the fundamental flaws and limitations of the large language models. So if we would like to improve the large language models, maybe we need to incorporate a metacognition through some processes, and that might be actually one of the promising ways we can mix consciousness studies with artificial intelligence research. So I think I'm coming quite close to the Kyoto station now, and this has been a really great monologue into my iPhone. I've been walking through the back streets of Kyoto, a great city, and it has been great to be discussing such things as metacognition and consciousness with you. The reason why I'm doing this, of course, is this is something that I need to do at this stage of my career. Unlike Lex Friedman, who has the ability to invite guests and discuss things, I don't have the ability to invite guests and discuss things, so I need to do it by myself. So I'm kind of a solitary Lex Friedman, but hopefully in the future I'll be able to invite some people for my YouTube videos. And anyway, it's a great way to talk through my ideas about metacognition and so on, like this. And it doesn't really matter how many of you would tune in. Well, it would be great if more of you would tune in, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, this is something I really need to do at this stage of my career, without any cost to you, unless you listen to this talk and find it fundamentally boring. I'm waiting for the traffic signal to change. I'm going to take that Shinkansen train and go back to Tokyo to give yet another public lecture about collective intelligence. Anyway, this is the life I lead in my home country, Japan. And I don't know why I'm doing this. I mean, this is something ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, I don't know why I'm doing this, but it makes sense to me to do this. And if I apply metacognition to this, I feel that talking to yourself like this is a great way of establishing a higher level of metacognition. I can't tell you exactly why I think so, but I intuitively feel like that. I'm now coming very close to Kyoto Station. I see people going to and fro, and it's a fine day. It's the end of February, and the cold winter is going to be over at last. And I feel as if I'm at crossroads in many aspects of my life, and I don't know if I ever would have a chance to listen to what I said today. But if I listen to this 10 years from now, I can't imagine how I would feel. I mean, that is kind of a metacognition, isn't it? I mean, cross-temporal metacognition. To look back on your past and realize what was happening then. And recording like this is actually a great way to form that cross-temporal metacognition, I think. And probably that's why I'm doing this. It's a time capsule, if you like, for me to be listened to by the future me. I hope the YouTube and the human civilization would be here to support that effort. So I need to close soon. So I will make final statements for this recording. Metacognition is a great way to know yourself. Like Socrates used to say, it is very important to know yourself, and it is a great way not only to enhance your knowledge, but also to realize that what you don't know. And after all, realizing what you don't know is a springboard for a great ocean of knowledge. And as a human species as a whole, we are entering a new era where it will become a daily occurrence, hopefully, for us to go into outer space. And when we go into outer space and look back on this blue planet, then and only then we would know what we didn't know. And that would be the start of a wonderful adventure. So thank you for listening.